Welcome back to another special boring history episode. Today we journey northward to a land of mist-shrouded highlands where ancient stone castles pierce the gray sky like broken teeth, and the wind carries whispers of blood feuds that lasted centuries. Medieval Scotland, a realm where the line between civilization and savagery was as thin as morning frost on heather. Before we begin our descent into this world of clan warfare and desperate survival, please take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Whether you're settling in for sleep in Tokyo or finding solace during a quiet afternoon in Manchester, we're grateful you've chosen to spend these moments with us. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to join our community of fellow history wanderers. Tonight we explore a profound paradox that defined medieval Scotland, a land that produced some of history's most romantic legends and heroic tales, yet harbored a reality so brutal that survival itself was an act of defiance against nature, neighbor, and fate. This is the story of a people caught between the hammer of English ambition and the anvil of their own savage customs, where honor was measured in blood spilled and loyalty was a currency more precious than gold. Let's set the stage, shall we? Picture, if you will, the Scotland of the 11th through 15th centuries. The year is perhaps 1314, just after Bannockburn, and you stand atop the ramparts of a border keep. Before you stretches a landscape that seems carved by the gods themselves, rolling hills draped in emerald and gold, rivers cutting silver wounds through ancient valleys, and forests so dense they swallow sound itself. Yet beneath this breathtaking beauty lies a truth that would chill the blood of any modern observer. This is a land where human life holds little value, where children learn to kill before they learn to read, and where the difference between a home and a fortress is merely academic. The Scotland we're about to explore existed in a state of perpetual warfare that makes the conflicts of other medieval realms seem almost quaint by comparison. Here, violence wasn't an interruption of daily life. It was daily life. The very geography that makes Scotland so hauntingly beautiful today conspired to make survival a matter of constant vigilance. Mountain passes that could be held by a handful of men became choke points where entire armies met their doom. Rivers that should have been highways of commerce became boundaries marked by the bones of those who dared to cross them uninvited. We'll explore the disturbing intimacy of clan warfare, where neighbors who shared blood and bread could become mortal enemies over a stolen cow or a perceived slight. We'll delve into the horrifying practicalities of medieval justice, where punishment was designed not merely to deter but to terrorize. And we'll examine the archaeological evidence that continues to emerge from Scottish soil, revealing truths about medieval life that chroniclers of the time either couldn't or wouldn't record. Let's begin by understanding the fundamental reality that shaped every aspect of medieval Scottish existence: the clan system. Imagine being born into a world where your surname determines not just your social standing but your sworn enemies, your potential marriage partners, and quite literally who has the right to kill you. The clan wasn't simply a family structure. It was a military organization disguised as kinship. Every man, woman, and child within the clan's protection existed first and foremost as a potential combatant or strategic asset. Children as young as 7 were taught to recognize the tartan patterns of enemy clans at a distance, to know which valleys were safe passage and which were killing grounds. Mothers would nurse their babies while keeping dirks within arm's reach, for in the Highlands an attack could come as easily from a neighboring glen as from a foreign army. Consider the horrifying efficiency of clan justice, as documented in the Chronicle of Melrose, when members of Clan Campbell discovered that their neighbors the MacGregors had stolen cattle during a particularly harsh winter of rather than simply reclaiming their livestock. The Campbells waited until the MacGregors' harvest festival, when the entire extended family had gathered in celebration. Under cover of darkness, they surrounded the settlement and set it ablaze. Those who fled the flames were cut down in the doorways of their burning homes. Those who remained inside were left to choose between sword and fire. But the true horror lay not in the slaughter itself, but in its methodical nature. The Campbell warband had brought sacks to collect the heads of their enemies, not as trophies but as proof of their thoroughness to present to rival clans. This wasn't rage or passion. This was business conducted with the same careful attention one might give to tending sheep or brewing ale. The practice of cleansing extended beyond mere revenge killings. When a clan faced the threat of starvation during Scotland's frequent famines, they would sometimes practice what they euphemistically called thinning the brand. The elderly, the infirm, and those deemed incapable of contributing to the clan's survival would simply disappear. Families would wake to find that a grandfather or a cousin with a withered arm had wandered into the moors during the night, never to return. No one spoke of these vanishings directly, but everyone understood. In a land where winter could kill as surely as any sword, sentiment was a luxury few could afford. The relationship between the Scottish clans and their environment reveals another layer of medieval brutality that modern minds struggle to comprehend. Scotland's climate during the medieval period was undergoing what historians now call the Little Ice Age, a gradual cooling that made already harsh winters nearly impossible to survive. Archaeological excavations at sites like Finladen, the ancient seat of the Lords of the Isles, have revealed mass graves containing the remains of entire families who perished during particularly severe winters, their bones showing clear evidence of malnutrition and violence. Recent DNA analysis of these remains, conducted by teams from the University of Edinburgh, has revealed something even more disturbing. Many of the skeletons show evidence of systematic violence, not the clean wounds of battlefield combat, but the jagged breaks and cuts that suggest prolonged torture. Carbon dating places these deaths during the winter of 1348, the same year the Black Death reached Scotland's shores. It appears that when faced with plague and famine simultaneously, some clans resorted to practices that defy modern understanding of human behavior. The bodies showed signs of being bound for extended periods before death, and forensic analysis of tool marks on the bones suggests they were killed with the same implements used for butchering livestock. The implication is almost too horrible to voice directly. When survival was at stake, the distinction between human and animal protein became dangerously blurred. This brings us to perhaps the most unsettling aspect of medieval Scottish life: the casual acceptance of practices that would horrify even hardened medieval observers from other lands. The concept of hospitality, so sacred in most cultures, took on a twisted dimension in the Scottish Highlands. Guest rights were indeed sacred, but the definition of guest was terrifyingly narrow. Chronicles from the period describe the practice of testing hospitality, a ritualized form of psychological torture, where strangers would be welcomed into clan holdings with elaborate courtesy, fed the finest available food, and treated with exquisite politeness, while their hosts decided whether they would be allowed to leave alive. The decision often hinged on factors as arbitrary as the visitor's accent, the quality of their clothing, or their knowledge of clan genealogy. Those who failed these invisible tests would find their generously provided meal was their last. The most chilling account comes from the diary of Brother Aldrich, a Benedictine monk traveling through the Western Highlands. He described being welcomed into the hall of a minor clan chief with warmth that seemed genuine. The hall was filled with laughter, music, and storytelling that continued deep into the night. Only when he woke the next morning did he discover that two other travelers who had arrived the same evening were nowhere to be seen. When he inquired, his host smiled pleasantly and explained that his guests had chosen to continue their journey in the early hours. Brother Aldrich noted that the morning porridge had an unusually rich flavor, and that his host watched him eat with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The monk's detailed account becomes even more disturbing when he describes finding in the midden behind the hall scraps of clothing that matched what the missing travelers had worn. More horrifying still was his observation that the clan's hunting dogs showed no interest in these textile remains, a detail that suggests the animals had already been well fed on something that removed their scavenging instinct. But perhaps nothing illustrates the brutal pragmatism of medieval Scottish life more clearly than their approach to child rearing. In a society where death could come from cold, starvation, disease, or violence at any moment, childhood was not a protected state, but a testing ground for survival. Children were valuable resources, but only if they proved capable of contributing to clan survival. The practice of proving was particularly brutal. Boys as young as 10 would be sent alone into the wilderness for periods ranging from days to entire seasons. Equipped with nothing but a knife and the clothes on their backs, they were expected to return with evidence of their ability to survive: animal pelts, knowledge of safe water sources, scars that proved they had faced danger and lived. Those who returned were welcomed as full members of the clan's warrior class. Those who didn't return were remembered only in the abstract, their names mentioned during the long winter nights as cautionary tales for the next generation of children approaching their own proving. Girls faced their own forms of testing, though these were often more psychologically cruel than physically dangerous. Young women would be placed in situations designed to test their loyalty to clan over personal feeling. They might be asked to tend to the wounds of captured enemies, knowing that showing too much compassion could be interpreted as disloyalty. They were expected to demonstrate their ability to endure the sight of violence without flinching, to prepare bodies for burial without showing emotion, and to continue their daily tasks even while the screams of torture victims echoed from the clan's dungeon. The archaeological record provides disturbing confirmation of these practices. Excavations at medieval Scottish settlements consistently revealed the remains of adolescents bearing injuries that healed poorly, evidence of surviving traumatic experiences during their youth. But more tellingly, these same sites often contained the remains of children who didn't survive to adulthood, their bones showing evidence of exposure, malnutrition, and sometimes violence. The harsh mathematics of medieval Scottish survival meant that not every child born could be allowed to consume resources that might be needed by those with better chances of survival. The religious life of medieval Scotland added another layer of complexity to this brutal existence. Christianity had taken root in Scotland, but it existed in a strange synthesis with older, darker traditions that predated the arrival of missionaries by centuries. Stone circles and ancient burial mounds were often incorporated into Christian worship, creating a religious practice that would have been barely recognizable to Christians in Rome or Canterbury. Scottish priests often served dual roles as clan advisors and, when necessary, as warriors. The distinction between sacred and secular authority became meaningless when survival was at stake. Church buildings doubled as fortresses, with thick walls designed to withstand siege and windows positioned for defensive archery rather than illumination. Mass might be interrupted by the need to repel raiders, and the same hands that consecrated the Eucharist might be stained with blood before the day was done. The practice of sanctuary took on particularly grim dimensions in medieval Scotland. While churches in other lands offered genuine protection to those who claimed sanctuary, Scottish churches often served as elaborate traps. Enemies who sought sanctuary would indeed be protected from immediate violence, but they would also be prevented from leaving. Days would turn to weeks as the sanctuary seeker slowly starved, legally protected but practically condemned. The clan that controlled the church could claim they had honored the sacred law of sanctuary while still achieving their goal of eliminating an enemy. Perhaps most disturbing were the rituals surrounding death and burial. In a land where winter ground was often too frozen to dig graves, the dead were sometimes stored in church crypts until spring thaw allowed for proper burial. But these crypts served another purpose. They became charnel houses, where clan enemies could be imprisoned and left to contemplate their fate surrounded by the decomposing remains of previous victims. Psychological torture of such confinement. Breathing air thick with the stench of decay while listening to the prayers of the living overhead was considered a particularly sophisticated form of clan justice. Modern forensic analysis of remains found in medieval Scottish church crypts has revealed evidence of this practice. Scratches on stone walls made by fingernails worn to the bone, human teeth marks on wooden beams. Foster children faced unique psychological traumas that have no modern equivalent. They were simultaneously treasured as symbols of alliance and resented as potential spies or saboteurs. Their loyalty was constantly tested through situations designed to pit their emotional bonds against their political obligations. A foster child might be required to participate in raids against their birth clan, or to provide intelligence that could be used to harm their biological siblings. The emotional development of these children was shaped by the understanding that their survival depended on their ability to compartmentalize their feelings and act purely in the interests of their foster clan. Love, affection, and family loyalty became tactical considerations rather than natural emotional responses. The result was a generation of adults who had learned to view human relationships through the lens of survival advantage, creating patterns of behavior that reinforced the clan system's brutal efficiency. Marriage customs in medieval Scotland reflected the same calculating approach to human relationships. Weddings were business transactions conducted with the same attention to detail that modern people might give to corporate mergers. The bride's value was calculated not in terms of beauty or personality, but in terms of the military intelligence she might provide, the strategic locations her dowry might include, and the fighting men her male relatives could contribute to clan conflicts. The wedding night itself was often a public affair, with clan elders present to witness the consummation that would seal the political alliance. Privacy was a concept that had little meaning in a society where individual desires were always subordinated to collective survival needs. The bride's experience of this intimate violation in front of witnesses was considered irrelevant compared to the clan's need to ensure that the marriage alliance was properly formalized. Domestic violence within these marriages was not simply tolerated but often encouraged as a form of political communication. A husband's treatment of his wife sent clear messages to her birth clan about the respect or contempt that her new clan held for the alliance. Brutal treatment might be calculated to provoke a response that would justify breaking the alliance, while excessive kindness might be interpreted as weakness that invited further exploitation. The most horrifying aspect of medieval Scottish marriage customs was the practice of testing wives through scenarios designed to force them to choose between loyalty to their birth clan and loyalty to their married clan. A wife might be given information about her birth family's military plans and then watch to see whether she would pass that intelligence to her husband. Those who failed these tests faced punishments that ranged from public humiliation to outright execution, while those who passed were rewarded with marginal increases in status that could be revoked at any time. The archaeological record provides chilling evidence of how these marriage customs affected the women who lived through them. Analysis of female skeletal remains from medieval Scottish sites shows patterns of injury that suggest systematic domestic violence was commonplace. But more disturbing are the remains that show evidence of fatal violence that occurred during or shortly after childbirth, suggesting that women who failed to produce male heirs or who were suspected of disloyalty might be killed at their most vulnerable moment. Recent DNA analysis of medieval Scottish cemetery sites has revealed another disturbing pattern. Many burial sites contain clusters of female remains that show no genetic relationship to the surrounding male burial. This suggests that women were often buried in their husbands' clan territories even when they died violently at their husbands' hands, while their birth families were either unaware of their fate or unable to demand justice for their death. The treatment of children in medieval Scotland was shaped by the constant awareness that most wouldn't survive to adulthood, creating child-rearing practices that seem almost sociopathic by modern standards. Emotional attachment to infants was actively discouraged, as parents who bonded too strongly with children were considered unfit for the harsh decisions that survival might require. Children who showed signs of physical weakness or developmental delays faced immediate elimination in many clans. This wasn't conducted through dramatic infanticide but through more subtle forms of neglect that allowed clan members to maintain plausible deniability. A sickly infant might simply receive less food, less warmth, less protection from the elements until natural causes completed what human calculation had begun. The children who survived this initial culling faced a childhood that was essentially military training disguised as normal development. Games and play activities were designed to teach skills needed for warfare, raiding, and survival. Children's toys were miniature weapons that taught proper grip and balance. Children's songs were memory devices for learning the genealogies of enemy clans and the locations of strategic resources. The psychological impact of this militarized childhood created adults who were supremely adapted to medieval Scottish life but who had never learned to form the emotional bonds that most humans consider fundamental to psychological health. Love, trust, and compassion were tactical considerations rather than natural responses, and the capacity for emotional connection was often viewed as a dangerous weakness that could compromise clan survival. Education in medieval Scotland was limited to practical skills needed for survival, with literacy reserved for a tiny elite whose primary function was maintaining clan records and conducting correspondence with allies and enemies. But even this limited education was shaped by the brutal realities of clan life. Children learned to read not through religious texts or classical literature, but through documents that detailed the genealogies of enemy clans, the terms of blood feuds, and the specific methods of violence that had been used against clan members in the past. The few surviving examples of medieval Scottish clan education materials reveal a curriculum that would horrify modern educators. Children were taught to recognize different types of wounds and their likely causes, not for medical purposes but to better understand how their enemies had died and what that information revealed about enemy fighting techniques. They learned to identify edible plants and safe water sources, but also to recognize the signs that food or water had been poisoned by hostile clans. Most disturbing of all, children were taught to evaluate human beings according to their potential value as allies, enemies, or resources. Education included detailed instruction in reading facial expressions, body language, and speech patterns to identify deception, weakness, or potential threat. Children learned to view every human interaction as a potential source of intelligence or danger, creating adults who could never fully trust anyone outside their immediate clan circle. The religious life of medieval Scotland was contaminated by these same survival imperatives, creating a form of Christianity that would have been barely recognizable to believers in more peaceful regions. Scottish churches served multiple functions as fortresses, meeting halls, food storage facilities, and prisons, with religious ceremonies adapted to accommodate these practical necessities. Sunday services might be interrupted by the need to interrogate prisoners held in church dungeons, with the screams of torture victims providing a backdrop to prayers for peace and salvation. Church bells served as early warning systems for raids, with different ringing patterns indicating the direction and estimated size of approaching threat. Even the most sacred ceremonies were planned with escape routes in mind, as wedding parties or funeral gatherings presented tempting targets for enemy raids. The Scottish clergy themselves were often indistinguishable from clan warriors in their methods and priorities. Priests were expected to fight alongside their parishioners during raids, and many carried weapons as routinely as they carried Bibles. Church records from the period contain matter-of-fact descriptions of clergy participation in torture, execution, and warfare, with no apparent sense that these activities conflicted with Christian teaching. The practice of giving sanctuary in Scottish churches became a sophisticated form of psychological torture that exploited religious law for tactical advantage. Enemies who claimed sanctuary would indeed be protected from immediate violence, but they would also be trapped within church walls while their captors devised increasingly creative forms of non-violent persecution. Sanctuary seekers might be deprived of food and water just to the point of survival, or subjected to constant psychological pressure designed to drive them to madness or suicide. Church burial grounds served dual purposes as cemeteries and as storage sites for the bodies of torture victims whose deaths needed to be concealed from outside observers. Graves would be dug deeper than necessary to accommodate multiple bodies, with legitimate clan members buried on top of murder victims whose presence would never be officially acknowledged. The consecrated ground that should have provided peace for the dead instead became a cover for ongoing atrocities against the living. Archaeological investigation of medieval Scottish church sites has revealed evidence of these practices that is both undeniable and deeply disturbing. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified burial sites containing far more human remains than church records would suggest, with body placement patterns that indicate hasty disposal rather than ceremonial burial. Excavation of these sites has uncovered remains showing evidence of torture and violent death mixed randomly with those showing natural death patterns. Carbon dating reveals that many of the violent deaths occurred during the same time periods as recorded clan conflicts, suggesting that churches served as convenient disposal sites for the victims of political violence. Most chilling of all, some sites have revealed evidence of what forensic anthropologists term ritualized violence, injuries that appear to have been inflicted according to specific patterns that suggest religious or magical significance. Victims were apparently tortured and killed according to procedures that combined Christian symbolism with much older, darker traditions that predated the arrival of Christianity in Scotland. The isolation of medieval Scottish communities created social dynamics that reinforced and amplified the brutal realities of clan life. Settlements might be cut off from outside contact for months at a time during harsh winters, creating pressure cooker environments where minor conflicts could escalate into life or death struggles purely through proximity and resource scarcity. Inbreeding within isolated clan communities created genetic problems that were often interpreted through supernatural or religious frameworks. Children born with developmental disabilities might be viewed as cursed by enemies or blessed with supernatural powers depending on political circumstances and clan needs. The birth of twins was often seen as